Today, we're following on from my last video exploring the beginnings of Weekly Shonen Jump by going into the next decade, the 1970s. While the 60s had Jump experiment with its format and would see it build its original roster of titles, the next decade would see Jump bolstering that roster with some bigger hits. Although, it would be a long and lengthy process, as these heavy hitters would be scattered throughout this decade. One thing that hasn't changed between the 60s and 1970 is the sheer number of titles that began within the year, with my count being 34, give or take, as some are quite short and may not count in your book, and I might have missed some, but either way, 34 new manga is insane. I think it goes without saying I won't be covering them all in detail, and I can't even if I want to because the info on some of these is really scarce. I'll be covering as much as I can, especially the most interesting manga I can find from this year, and there might be a couple you can try it for yourself. Apologies in advance if I mispronounce anything or I get things wrong. These things are a given when you're looking into these old manga, but I'll do my best. As I mentioned in the last video in the section on Chichi no Tamashi, which is still one of Jump's frontrunners at this time in 1970, baseball would be huge in these early years of Jump, and our first series of 1970 is a baseball manga called Animal Kyujo, translated to English as Animal Stadium. It was written by Haruna Miyazuki, which lasted 2 volumes and 11 chapters. It seems to follow a baseballer for a team called the Giants, who lost his eye to a dead ball. Then, ridiculed by that team and thrown out of it, he ends up gathering 9 new players, forming a new team called the Animals. Players who possessed great ability and would be able to defeat the Giants. It sounds like a really cool, short sports revenge story to me, with some animal theming. Since we're already on the subject of baseball, I want to bring up the other 3 baseball series that began serialization in 1970, which are Namida no Gyakuten Homa, Gappare Ota Toshu, and Kyosoku 0.25 Pyo. Miyazuki also worked on the first and last of these, clearly passionate about manga and baseball. Sadly, none of these lasted longer than 10 chapters, and I don't have much to say about them. Moving on, we have Nasuto, which is a really bizarre manga that's basically a Lupin the Third ripoff, and you can just tell by comparing Nasuto and Lupin's designs. It was written by Kano Bancho and lasted 17 chapters, with people speculating it got cancelled and didn't receive a volume release due to fears of copyright from Monkey Punch and their publishers. An illustrator named Tad Hoshia made some parody images with Nasuto similar to the illustrations for Lupin's 50th anniversary, which is pretty weird seeing how old and obscure this manga is. I wouldn't have thought anyone would remember it. This is a manga you can actually read too, because a Lupin fan named Isterion has translated the first 2 chapters. Expect jokes about stealing, thieving, harassing ladies, and things from Lupin III, but with less class. Siberia no Kiba, or Siberian Fangs, by Koichi Ikenai, seems to be about a hunter and his dog fighting things like tigers in what I presume to be the Siberian mountains, although the Siberian part could be referring to the main wolf as being a Siberian wolf. It seems to be a wilderness survival battle manga, but only lasted 10 chapters, with information about it being scarce. Although, it was featured on a Reddit Shonen Jump iceberg by user Semideus, listed in its final tier. It seems like they just picked whatever unknown manga they could find though, since I don't think this manga has any especially notable qualities. Its premise is cool though, and would be seen again with manga like Ginga Nageriboshi Gin from the 80s. Ore wa Gebatetsu was created by Fujio Akatsuka and is a gag manga that ran for 18 chapters and 2 volumes, seemingly about a boy and his dog. The author's name may be familiar to you, as they're the creator of Osumatsu-san. It's cool to see another big name in Jump, even though the manga they made is fairly obscure. Totsugeki Totsugeki Ramen by Mikiya Mochizuki, translated to Ramen Charge or Charge Ramen, looks to be about a boy who runs a ramen stall, with possibly combat elements based on the covers, or they could be equating food service to a battle. It would only go on for 2 volumes and 14 chapters before ending, but I thought I'd bring this one up anyway to highlight the variety of manga that was being serialized at the time. And while this wouldn't be a hit, it's nice to see a cooking manga in Jump at this time. Mochizuki himself was quite prolific, with his biggest series being Wild 7. But the most interesting thing he's done to me is illustrating some of the X-Files manga. From what I can tell, he seems to be attributed to Volume 3, so must have covered either Shadows or Fire, probably the former. This has nothing to do with Shonen Jump, but it's something I'm especially interested in and would love to cover one day, provided I could find anything more about it. Worst by Kotaro Komuro is a science fiction dystopia story focusing on humans and a group of mutants called the Worst Men. The manga is split into 3 parts with 37 total chapters, in 4 volumes. It's had some praise for its art and story, as the mangaka was Osamu Tezuka's pupil. I think it would have been interesting having Worst in the magazine as a solid, serious sci-fi story that would have been quite engaging amongst all the gag and delinquent manga the magazine had at the time. Fellow YouTuber Smizzle has a video on Worst and it goes in depth as he can on it, which is an entertaining and informative watch, which I push you to check out. And since we're on the topic of Smizzle, he's actually done a few videos on older Shonen Jump manga, and these so happen to have also begun serialization in 1970. So we're going to go out of chronological order for a bit to talk about them. The first is Genyaku Seisho by George Akiyama, a familiar name if you watched my first video. Smizzle has a short going over a character that seems to be the first black protagonist in Shonen Jump, something that would have been pretty rare back then and still is to this day. It looks as though the manga jumps between different protagonists and is possibly something to do with religion or occult, based on the chapter titles I could find, although this is just speculation. One chapter Smizzle mentions features a father and son singing and playing for the entire chapter until at the very end the father dies, which is very on brand for George Akiyama but incredibly dark for Jump. It ran for 33 chapters, which was a decent amount for the time, and was compiled later in George Akiyama's career into 2 volumes. The other manga Smizzle has covered is Ashita wa Tsukameru ka, or in English, Can You Grab Tomorrow, by Toru Shinohara. Smizzle actually has 2 videos on this, one where he tries to find a lost Shonen Jump series, and another where he ends up buying the issue it debuted in. From Smizzle's video, he shares that the protagonist's name is Tatsuya Hayami, and that he's likely fighting the Yakuza or debt collectors for his dad. It's possibly about trying to wrench back their life from these figures who want their money, thus the title. The author is known for his works with strong female characters and has quite a large body of work overall, but nothing that sticks out too much to me. It had 10 chapters in total and didn't stick around for very long. All 4 of Smizzle's videos are well made and interesting, and I'll link them all below. It's really great to see other people invested in Jump's early years like he is. Arashi Sanpiki by Satoshi Ikezawa is our first real big hit of 1970 and was a gag manga with more of an ecchi focus on raunchy comedy. It sounds as if the male and female students had a rivalry and gags would ensue based on that. The protagonist is likely a character called Rock Umezato, who is half American, and is one of the first non-dark-haired characters I've seen so far in Jump's early history. The series got an impressive 16 volumes and 163 chapters, but sadly there are no translations, which means I don't know much about it. Satoshi Ikezawa would go on to make lots more manga, including Circuit no Okami, a future Jump racing manga. Sennen Ukoku by Shigeru Mizuki, or Millennium Kingdom, was a 30-chapter 3-volume series, possibly based on Akuma-kun, a 4-chapter short series by Mizuki. The author is known for Gegege no Kitaro, and the similar art style and monster leads me to believe that this was another one of his yokai-centric stories. A neat fact about Shigeru Mizuki is that he lost his arm fighting in war, but through his love of manga managed to learn how to draw manga with his other hand, and to great results too. This is one I mentioned for the author because it's someone else who's fairly well known and has made something important. Okinawa by Keiji Nakazawa of Barefoot Gen fame lasted 7 chapters and is set in the province of Okinawa in Naha City, 1968, during the Vietnam War, where it was being used by US forces. The main character, Saburo, has his house destroyed by a drunk pilot of a B-52 bomber, which kills his mother. It sounds like it was tapping into similar emotions of his other work, mainly the anger and sadness which are associated with war. Particularly the way innocent people are harmed by it. There's a focus on the powerlessness of the Okinawan inhabitants as soldiers move around their land and homes, capturing the pain that war and conflict has on their day-to-day lives, even if they aren't a part of it. A different but welcome story in Jump. As we can see by how long Arashi-san Piki lasted, comedy manga in Jump were very big at the time, successful and long-lasting. A lot of modern Jump fans seem to dismiss comedy manga today, but for the longest time it's actually been pivotal to Jump's success. From here on out, there'll always be a huge comedy manga in Jump, especially when we reach Kochikame in a few years. The next 3 manga I want to talk about would influence other comedy manga for decades to come, it all trickling down to modern day with titles like Me and Roboko, a current staple of the magazine in 2023. The first comedy manga we'll start with is Manga Drifters by Yuya Emoto, who finished up Manga Conte 55 Go, which we covered in the last video. Manga Drifters ran for an astounding 268 chapters. I'm not sure what it was about though, perhaps following other comedians like the previous manga. Either way, it managed to last a long time and wouldn't be the only gag manga to do so from 1970. Dr. Toilet was another gag manga written by Kazuyoshi Tori that amassed a total of 319 chapters in 30 volumes, eventually becoming the longest running Jump manga for a time, having an impressive 7-year run from 1970 to 1977, only with its streak being beaten by Kochikame in 1984. It initially followed Dr. Toilet, who studied scatology but changed direction early on in its run to focus on a school setting. It was filled with all sorts of crude humor and potty jokes, as you'd expect from the title, but it seemed to contribute a lot to Jump, helping pioneer the friendship effort victory motto. It managed to get printings in France and South Korea too, and sold very well in Japan, a hidden pillar of Jumps perhaps that not many people mention. And finally, we have Dokonjo Gairu, or The Gutsy Frog, by Yasumi Yoshizawa. It follows Hiroshi, a middle schooler who trips on a frog named Pyonkichi, who becomes trapped as an imprint on his shirt. It's a gag manga that uses Pyonkichi's abilities to bite, swim, and talk as he's stuck on the shirt to bring Hiroshi into some funny situations. It had 296 chapters in Jump, or 308 according to AniList for some reason, and it was compiled into 27 volumes. It also had a 1972 anime with 103 episodes, and a follow-up anime in 1981 with 30 episodes. It would also get a 10-episode drama in 2015. It is Yasumi Yoshizawa's most notable work, with his daughter Yuko Utsuki even making an autobiographical manga called Dokonoju Gairu no Musume, following her childhood and the tough upbringing she had, focusing on the impact the Gutsy Frog had on her life and family growing up. It's still apparently ongoing and started in 2015, but it's likely not ever going to be translated in English. The Gutsy Frog seems to be another one of Jump's early big hits, a comedy too, and not as crude as some of the others like Shameless School or Dr. Toilet. It's also another manga you can actually read, with me finding the first 3 chapters fan translated before figuring out that you can read a large majority of it on the Manga Mo app officially, or at least you could have when I last checked. If you can read it in some way, I definitely recommend it, as it's something fairly cute and funny. As I mentioned earlier, this is only a selection of the manga from 1970. There's a lot that I could mention that sound interesting, like Akuma no Mizu, Devil's Water, which is a really sick name for a manga, or Black Pro Fighter Takeru, a dark looking martial arts manga with some really nice art. There's also Aitsu, a horror looking manga which possibly has vampires. But with manga like these, what I just said is all I have to go on. It's merely short bursts of speculation. So much manga in this time period, from the 60s to even the 80s, is largely untranslated, undocumented, and either extremely difficult to get your hands on or impossible. But even if that's the case, in some form they still exist. I'm talking about them right now, even if all I have is a basic description and their name. And I'm glad that Jump overall is so well documented, because it's fascinating to go delving for this information and to speculate on what some of these mangas might be like. And fun fact before we end the video, out of the 48 covers that Jump released in 1970, 15 of them feature Mankichi from Oto Ipiki Gaki Daisho as their main focus. If you include group covers and smaller promos, Mankichi would be on over half of these covers probably. I'm mentioning this just to push the idea that Otoko Ipiki was basically the One Piece or Dragon Ball of its generation, and that we should be talking more about it and celebrating it, even reading it. I hope you've enjoyed this video and learned something new about Jump. Maybe you'll even check out Nasuto or the Gutsy Frog, and one day there might be more manga from 1970 which will get translated, who knows. In the meantime, while I work on the next video delving deeper into this decade of Jump, you can subscribe for similar content. I might veer away from Shonen Jump and manga sometimes, like in my recent X-Files tier list video, or I might just talk about newer manga I've read from Jump. I'm not 100% sure what I'll be making next, but I'll do my best to make something. You can also follow me on Twitter for the occasional manga ramblings, Weekly Shonen Jump rankings, and art. And other than that, thank you for watching and take care.